This is Things Police See, First-Hand Accounts, with your host, Steve Gould.
Hey guys, welcome to the podcast that interviews active and retired police officers about their most intense, bizarre, and sometimes humorous moments on the job. I'm your host, Steve Gould. Thank you for joining us, everybody. This is going to be a special episode. It's a little bit off format, but it's I'm excited to do it. I think you guys are going to really enjoy it. I had this idea of myself. I was going to, every time there's a police event in the news and it's controversial, it gets everywhere, and they start hammering the cops, and eventually it gets out, well, these cops, these are racist cops. And then the next step is, well, policing in general is just racist. And then at its inception, policing has been racist. The only thing we can do is get rid of it. So it's just kind of this madness that steps up, and it's super aggravating. I get messages from you guys whenever it's going on, and I thought maybe I could do an episode where I talk about the history of policing and how it relates to racism and culture and how it evolved. Then I realized I just don't have the bandwidth to do that. I started reading about it, and I was like, I gotta know a guy who can take care of this. So I do have him coming on the show. Before I introduce you to our guest, I want to thank you guys for all the 5-star reviews. We're up to 815 or something. I'd love to get to 1,000, 1K, be up there with the big dogs. That'd be awesome. So, if I always say it, if you can do nothing else, just a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts is awesome. If you really, really love the show, Patreon's where it's at. The link's in the show notes. You can go there and you can join. It's $5 or $10, patrolman or sergeant. You get different things for each one. And that's if you really love the show. But if you can't afford it or it's not in the budget, don't worry about it. The show's going to remain free, and you can keep enjoying it that way. So Avid Company is a sponsor of this podcast. I've told you before about their clip-lock modular holster system, but I wanted to specifically highlight the lockbox that goes with it. The lockbox is designed not just for your car, but basically anywhere you want to store a firearm, such as in a safe or at work or your home office. Like the clip lock, the lockbox is an American-made, patented design that allows you to transfer your firearm without ever taking it out of the holster. How cool is that, you guys? You have it on your belt, unclick it, click it into your car, click it under your desk at work, click it in your safe. For my ASMR fans out there, lots of clicking. You're going to love it. The lockbox works with most clip-lock holsters, so you can store your firearms with the same convenience and dependability no matter what firearm you may be carrying. Avid has added a new video showing how the lockbox works on their website. Just go to avidcompany.com, that's AVID company.com, and check it out. If you scroll down, it's in the middle of their homepage. Don't forget, Avid donates a portion of all profits to support service members, veterans, law enforcement, and this podcast, Things Police See. Back to our guest who's on the show. Like I had said before, I want to talk about the history of policing and specifically how it relates to racism and everything that we hear in the media. And, so I thought, I know a guy who probably could really crush this. And I'm a fan of his podcast. He does a podcast with Pastor Jonathan Fisk. It's and he is Pastor Adam Koontz. He's also a doctor. They do a podcast called A Brief History of Power, where they kind of, there's theology involved, but also just the history of the world, the culture, and how things evolved, how we got to where we are right now. Super interesting podcast. They both do a great job. But, Pastor Fisk had and still does have his own podcast, Stop the White Noise, with his wife, Meredith. It's great. They talk about culture and Christian worldview, and it's really great and really entertaining. But Pastor Fisk kind of had this friend, Pastor Koontz, and he kind of knew this guy's bandwidth was large. And he knew, I'm just ad-libbing here, and Pastor Koontz can correct me, but it seems like he knew this guy, his buddy, needed a show to come on and really just speak to all these different subjects and just to share him. I mean, he's just got a great intellect, and he seemingly knows everything about the world. I know he's probably not going to agree with that statement, but it just seems like it. So I reached out to my pastor, is friends and knows him. I had him reach out. He said, sure, why not? And here we are. So without further ado, let me welcome on Pastor Dr. Adam Koontz.
Hey, it's great to be with you. And hard disagree, don't know everything. And the listeners will figure that out as we go along today.
I knew you were going to say something like that. Pastor Koontz, is policing throughout history, was it established and does it maintain racism? Was it born in racism, and is that what policing is?
No, not at all. And I think probably the first thing to address is just the way that things like this work, and maybe the reason that guys are messaging you as soon as you have some kind of, police incident that makes the news either locally or, heaven forbid, nationally, is because the word racist is one of those vague but terrifying words that is kind of a shutdown word. And it's especially a shutdown word for anybody in law enforcement or the judicial system broadly, because it's obviously the opposite of being just with people.
Right.
You're showing partiality. You're deciding beforehand, this person's a criminal or this person is going to have problems, so I need to solve that, kind of a, pre-crime reaction to things. And so it's such a shutdown accusation, and even just a word, even if it's just used in the media, which is sort of a court system before you get into a court system or a disciplinary proceeding. So when you're dealing with that, you have to recognize just the power that the accusation has, and the fact that you can be convicted of that in the media long before or even without any other kind of formal proceeding. So that's why it's so powerful, just in and of itself. And so I want to respect the power that has, even though I don't think it's just that it has that kind of power, that it can just be used. And now that's what people are going to hear about the police or about this specific officer, or his life is going to be ruined, basically because that word was used in connection with his conduct.
Right. Yeah, like Darren Wilson, perfect example. Michael Brown.
Yes,
been totally debunked. It's not what happened. He was justly shot and killed by the police, and it's not even a question. Right. I mean, Obama sent in his Justice Department to get this cop. Mm-hmm. Couldn't do it, but it seemingly doesn't matter because, like you said, it doesn't even have to be an event like this. You could just say something and you're guilty.
Yeah, and the debunking process, or even, at best, some kind of formal exoneration or reinstatement or something is not how these things work. So Christians will talk about not bearing false testimony. And part of the reason we do that is because your reputation is at least as valuable, and sometimes a lot more valuable, both individually, but then also collectively as the police or this city's police force or whatever. Your reputation is at least as valuable, and sometimes more valuable, than anything else. And your reputation can be destroyed long before and remain destroyed long after the facts have been proven to be the opposite of what was first said. So, that's why this is just kind of an incredibly powerful accusation. But the issue is just kind of misconceived, set up the wrong way to begin with, because policing as we know it is not a result of, trying to handle racial differences or tensions between communities or anything like that. It's really a result of urbanization. So there's a point in human history, really before the 18th century, early 19th century, when cities really are not large enough to have things resembling modern police forces, professionalized police. Those duties, if you have somebody that needs to keep the peace or keep the streets quiet, particularly at night or something, are going to be either non-professional or they're going to be extremely limited. So you might have something that kind of seems like a police force that is maybe part of like a military or something. And you'll find that kind of anywhere you have enough people. So that might be in Japan, in what we would call the Middle Ages in the West, or that might be inside a palace or something in London or Paris, or something. But you don't have something resembling modern police forces, basically because you don't have population concentrations large enough. And this sounds kind of weird, but basically like energy sources powerful enough to keep cities and people running full force particularly at night.
Right.
So think it's sort of like, if you can imagine the difference even between what people could get up to today out in the country versus, think about like when maybe you go camping with your kids and basically everybody's asleep by like 8:30 because there's kind of nothing else to do. Right. Like life before a certain point for the vast majority of the world population is kind of like going camping all the time. So especially you guys know much better than I do, although I know that people get up to a lot of stupid things that I have to deal with, maybe not right at that moment like you do, but later on at night. That is, people do most of their evil at night. A lot of those problems are just different when populations and the energy to keep them going is just a lot lower. So you begin to get modern police forces as a result of really the growth of modern energy sources and therefore also modern cities.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I work where I work now is very rural, and it's awesome. Like I love it. We're my wife and I are of the opinion, after living in a couple different places in the country and living in cities and then in the country, and just humanity doesn't do well in cities. Like it just I mean, that's a very layman's observation, but like from what I see, it's not going well for you guys. It goes better when you have some land, and like where I work now is if someone takes a day off and there's no coverage, we'll let a whole shift go with, they might call us in for something serious, but like you said, when it gets dark in a bedroom community that's not concentrated, people kind of, and they've always been like this in this area, you might come to the office in the morning and have people might call in and say, hey, this happened last night, but they tend to not rely so heavily either on inviting the police force,
That's right. Yeah, because the other thing that happens with urbanization is not only do you get people concentrated, and Christians would say that the reason that cities are different in that way is because when you get people concentrated, it's basically like getting dirt concentrated, but this would be like spiritual dirt concentrated in one place is what happens when you get urbanization. But you also have what you're referring to, which is basically like much more of life is much more distanced from other private people. So you're not connected to your family, maybe, or you're not connected to your neighbors. So it's easier, it's going to be more common to call in some other authority to keep the peace. So when you're talking about, okay, maybe take one of your more famous kind of very early police forces, which is in London. These are the Bow Street Runners. Maybe some of you guys have heard of this kind of a thing. This is like and Bobbies? These guys are this is like the grandfathers of Bobbies. Okay. So they are certainly, compared to even British police forces today, they're extremely poorly armed. In fact, they're not really armed.
Like now.
Yeah. Right. And so they are there to keep the peace. But this idea of the peace, which is much older than modern police forces, so you can breach the peace, or you have a very low-level judicial officials called justices of the peace. Right. The idea is that in a modern city, the peace cannot be kept without intervening authorities. And that's what you're going to get as your first professionalized. So the Bow Street Runners get hired by a man named Sir Robert Peel to police certain parts of London. So not even all of London. So this isn't truly a metropolitan police force, but it's there. This is 1820s, going into 1830s. It's there to keep a peace that they're recognizing we just have too many people. We can't keep the peace. These people don't know each other. They don't respect each other. They have nothing in common. Now, the thing to remember about this is London in the 1820s would be about as racially homogeneous as maybe where you live today. Maybe, I don't know, but it's about as homogeneous as you could possibly get.
Right.
So the issue here is that policing, as we know it, as it begins to grow, and then that'll develop into bobbies. In America, your first maybe modern police force would be the NYPD. roughly around the same time, a little bit after, maybe about a decade after, these things come into existence, not because of racial diversity or any of the tensions that brings, but really because of urbanization, even of racially totally homogeneous populations. So in 1840s New York, your tension is not racial. It's class tension. It's poor versus rich, or maybe it's ethnic stuff we don't even think that much about anymore. So it's Irish versus Scots Irish, so Catholic versus Protestant kind of a thing. So it just doesn't factually have to do with policing people because they're this race or that race.
Right. I've heard that before, that the whole race thing is more of a tool for politicians, and what it really is class warfare. That's the race thing is what they use to ignite, but really it's about class.
Yeah, I think that when you're talking about American politics, you have to realize that usually differences that would be clearly identified in a European country that's going to be more racially homogeneous as class differences are often outsourced very quickly to racial differences. And what that does is that really prevents the discussion of class differences from taking place, and you'd have to go back to a different time when you have less racial diversity, especially in northern cities in the United States, in order to reach a point where they were talking about class difference. But I think that if you want to talk about policing and class difference, what I've said so far really has to do with cities. There's kind of another origin, and this is usually behind, say, maybe the state police in any given state. And that usually does have to do explicitly with class difference, because a lot of our state police forces got started policing labor disputes. That's definitely the case in Pennsylvania. That's the case in Colorado, is that you would have large labor forces that would go on strike, and they would be counteracted by Pennsylvania State Police get started as the coal and iron police.
Really? That's bizarre.
Yeah, they're basically policing
like Pinkertons.
Coal mining. Yeah, and they are connected to the Pinkertons. But the idea that the urban or metropolitan police force, that is, when people think of the police, they're probably not thinking of the state police unless they're speeding on an interstate.
Right.
When we're talking about who's going to show up if you say we have a problem at this address, those guys come into being basically because of population growth, apart from, and in most cases, certainly in Europe and the northern United States, long before you have anything resembling racial diversity in that place.
Interesting. Yeah, the state police in Mass I'm old enough to know guys whose grandfathers slept at the barracks. It was a barracks because that's where they lived. And,
yeah, right.
And it was almost like, I don't really know the history of Mass State Police that well, but it just seemed like the governor needed an arm of enforcement. It seemed like he needed, why would all these local chiefs listen to him? They'd all have a different opinion, but now he can have a state force who's going to enforce state law. And while they're at the barracks, they can head out and do some traffic once the advent of radar came along and all that.
And there's a relationship there that you're pointing out with the state police that really does matter when you're also thinking about, is policing generally this, that, or the other thing. And I think one reason that's difficult to answer, I don't think it's racist, but let's say, is policing responsive to local communities or something? You could form that question differently. The reason that's somewhat difficult to answer is that the different levels of police or different forms of police often come into being at different times for different reasons. So sheriffs are older as a form of policing than almost anything anywhere else in the United States, because we kind of inherit it from the Middle Ages. Then you've got local police, which is what we've been mainly talking about. Your state police come about for different reasons, and partly because militia and National Guards are not being called out after our Civil War. And so the governor, if he needs a force of guys, what does he have? So the state police are going to come into being for that reason. And then your very large urban departments, something like the NYPD that has like its own intelligence arm and something is kind of, yeah, exactly. It's just a completely different animal altogether. And what happens when you get criticism, as you have, especially in the past, roughly 2.5 years of the police, defund the police, is what I think that usually means is, and I think this is really unfortunate, are your most local guys, right? That's not really a serious call about how, New York City's budget should relate to the NYPD, or whether all those relationships that exist between NYPD and FBI, or the FBI, we haven't even talked about nationalized law enforcement, should go away. That's really about the local guys, right? It's the local guys who are being accused, whether you're talking about, county level sheriff and deputies or, metropolitan municipal police. It's the local guys who are being put forward as, look at this, video cam footage from Ohio or Georgia or wherever. They're not saying that about some kind of nationalized police force. They're not saying like, we're going to get rid of the ATF, right? Right. They're really pretty much always talking about local level guys when they're saying defund them or that they're racist or whatever.
Yeah, it is really weird. The public treats us like a national police force, because I can tell you right now, if there's a national event and in California, all of us cops who head into work in Massachusetts go, here we go, we're going to hear it today because this happened, as if where we work has ever had a single problem. Like it's, you know what I mean? It's like, it's
That's right. Yep.
Massachusetts is undertaking this huge police reform where honestly parts of it are good, because Massachusetts is they've kind of left it to the departments to standardize. They give suggestions, the Mass Police Training Council, but now they're going to go post. So we're going to have standardized training. But, but there was just an article that I read, and it picked like a few of the states that have the best track record for policing, and Massachusetts is one of them. And the reason for it is the little fiefdoms. The sheriffs in Massachusetts have no police authority. They run the jails.
Okay.
And like you were saying before, because of its ancient origin, they can enforce like 2 or 3 laws, one of them being breach of the peace, restoring the order, because they go back to the days of constables in Massachusetts. They're very old. Right. So we have every single town in Massachusetts is required to have a chief of police, whether it's part-time, full-time, they have to have a police force, but that forces that police force to be very local and to know the population. So
that's right.
When you join this police force in one of these small towns, it's not long before you get in a coffee at the country store and somebody's going, "Hey, Steve, good to see you." It's like, hey, like they know me. And
yeah, they do. Yeah.
And through my experience, and it's not scalable, like you can't do it in a city, but through my experience, it's like the purest and most effective form of policing is to like know the like I literally I've had a cup of coffee at the country store, and like 5 hours later, been to a house from someone who I met at the country store whose family member was having a mental health crisis. And it was like, thank goodness it's Steve.
Yeah.
And it made everything good.
No question.
But you can't do that in cities,
You can't. But I think that, what we're actually talking about when we're talking about the accusation is policing racist, is that the person issuing that accusation, because that's what that is, even as a question, the person issuing that accusation is actually talking not so much about policing or whether you know the guy's name, whose house you're showing up at, and whether that's actually a better way to live than the way that he lives in whatever anonymous urban center he lives in. This is really about whether local people will have any capacity to shape their life the way they want, or whether they will, like people in large anonymous areas, be subject to basically force that is much more responsive to centralized government. That I think is ultimately what this is about, because what you can see is that the guy who is in a police force of 30,000 in the NYPD, or the guy who is nationalized and is being sent in, just hypothetically, let's say he lives in the DC suburbs and he's sent to deal with some problem that whatever centralized authority has decided exists in Ohio or Georgia or wherever. is that he doesn't live with the people that he's dealing with. And you know as well as I do whether, lethal force is involved or not, that you will approach people very differently if you know them and understand them,
sure,
and your kids play ball with them, than if they are just a problem that you have to solve so that you can collect your paycheck.
Absolutely.
So I think that what is actually, defund the police never actually meant defund the police. It meant defund the local guy and fund the guy who will be responsive not to local people, but to whatever is higher up the food chain in modern America. I really think that's what it's all about. And so I take the question, is policing racist? We talked about how it's historically false, but it's also not sincere.
Right. Absolutely. I'm hoping people are getting fatigue of it. Like they're
and I think they are, because at least in private, maybe they're not saying this directly to whatever HR personnel at work or something, but at least in private, they are starting to roll their eyes if something is described as racist, because everything has, showing up on time to things has been deemed racist, like everything. And so if everything is racist, then nothing is racist. It's not even a meaningful word in that case.
It's too bad too. I went to college, had the American college experience for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to school with bunch of white dudes, black dudes, Asian dudes. And we had no better time than we would just make fun of each other for our races. You know what I mean? It's like so much fun when you're comfortable with somebody and they can you just all the cliche garbage that like isn't true, but it's just fun to rag on each other. And I think back to those conversations and I think, geez, if anybody was ever a fly on the wall or took a recording of us, they would be like, I would be the only one in trouble, really, if I'm the white face in the room.
Yes, right.
I was listening to a podcast the other day, great podcast, and there was 4 black guests on, and one of them was late to the podcast. So one of the other black guests goes, "Well, you're the latest because you're the darkest," referring to his skin. And the white host was like, just say, he goes, I can't, right, he goes, guys, honestly, I can't say a word about this. And they were like, lighten up, man. We're just having a good time. But it's to the point now where like the white guy, the host of the show is like, I'm not going to even comment. It's like, come on, man. It's like, no, but again, like you said, they can just take a soundbite out of context and
that's correct.
You're done,
Yeah. And I think that is a danger for both white police, but also white people in situations involving police, is that if racism means anything, it has to do with being unjust to people on account of their race. And obviously the people that are most in danger of being accused of that, as well as the people that would be, least subject to getting any attention for being mistreated on account of the race, at this point would be whites. So that's where racism and racist really have almost only one. It kind of only goes in one direction. And because of that, it's not that racism is unreal. It's that it really is only used in, if you can accept it this way, a racist fashion with or against whites. And that's a problem, because what you're there to do in both law enforcement and the legal system generally is to provide justice, which just by its nature does not depend on the person's race.
Right.
It depends on the person's actions. Right. I cannot and I should not be convicted of anything on the basis of my race. I can and should be convicted because I broke into this person's house, or because I lied about the business agreement that I made, or whatever the case may be. It's on the basis of my actions, right? And so I think whether you are coming at it from the perspective of someone simply subject to the law, or someone enforcing the law, the problem with race in America is that it is really just, it has become, and you can hear it in the accusation racist, it has become simply a political tool.
Right.
Yeah. And that's my major concern going forward, is that, if the races are reversed in the case of Mike Brown and Darren Wilson, you don't even have a news story, maybe not even in the St. Louis area.
Yeah.
Because when you look at, like you said, what occurred, you don't have some enormous injustice. You have a viable physical threat to an officer of the law and a justified response. And the way that you can tell that there is injustice in the discussion around it is that if you reverse the races, you might not even have a news story, let alone a cause for national unrest and rioting and everything else that's come out of that.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it for, there's a lot of people in this country. There's 350 million or whatever. And there's almost a million cops. It's amazing to me cops aren't shooting more people, honestly. But, there's enough cases of cops shooting white people that it's a questionable use of force. You will not even hear about it.
No.
If it's over the top and the cop was like dead wrong.
Yeah.
Some of them are egregious. You will not, it's not even, let me ask you this, Pastor Koontz. LAPD, here's a city that has tried really hard to match their demographics. So in other words, the majority of their officers are Hispanic. The second is white, and then Black, Asian. They do this because I worked there. And they're actually breaking some state laws, but the way they man their police department. Yeah. But they're trying to match the community. So I can kind of get what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they're in the neighborhoods all the time. They're going to neighborhood meetings constantly. I mean, you want to throw around the word community policing. These guys are like begging the community. Yeah, they're in there, man. They're sending captains. They're going, and it doesn't matter. It's just not working. And when you look at the stats, like you'll see a woman stand up and be like, hey, my son was murdered by the police and blah, 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 blah. And then you hear the backstory. Her son was a crack dealer. He stabbed a lady in the eye. Then he stabbed a cop. And then unfortunately they had to kill him. But it's like the whole neighborhood's like, yeah, you killed her son. It's like, it's like detached from reality. And a lot of it is just kind of like she probably has a bunch of guilt about where she was raising her kid and how she couldn't do it right and all that stuff. But like all this to say, like all these stats that come out, especially from a place like LA, is they have an awful lot of Hispanic cops policing the gangs in East LA. And there's a whole lot of Black cops policing the Black gangs. And by the way, all these stop figures they come out with, how racist they are because of their race, they're being stopped by their own race. But so where does that leave you with the claim of racism when there's a Black cop stopping Black youth who are gang members? I mean, is that racism now? Are they like race traitors? What are they doing?
Yeah, well, they will, and they have been accused of being race traitors, or in, let's say it's Miami, so the cops are technically maybe Hispanic, but they're too white because they're Cuban. They're not the right kind of Hispanic.
They look white, yeah.
That's right. The reason that these things will go on and on and on, or the reason that the LA City Council had the big blow up that they did last month about Hispanics complaining about Blacks, is because what you're actually dealing with is a fundamentally political question that can't be answered through or by police who are not there to figure out who gets which slice of the pie. By their nature, they're there to enforce the laws equitably. Justice wears a blindfold on statues because she is there because stealing is wrong, regardless of what my genetic makeup is or, how much lactose I can process naturally. Right. Okay. It doesn't have, justice is not there to take account of, what you could tell about me based on, seeing me on TV or talking to me on the phone. The reason that these things cannot be solved either via quotas on police forces or any other means that you're going to run through, whether it's how we cover the police in the media or who we appoint as chief, right? So you can have, you can have a black chief of a majority white city. You would not get a white chief of a majority black city. It's not going to happen,
right?
Because racial politics cannot be solved via the police in any form. Whether it's there, you guys are never going to do enough to resolve problems that are there.
We're dealing with the end result.
You are dealing with the end. You guys are getting the short end of the stick basically every time,
right?
Because you're not even always pawns. In the case of the LAPD and their sort of trying to be racially attuned, and are they doing that on the level of ethnicity with Hispanics? Or I don't know any of the answers to those questions, but even when you're not a pawn, you're not going to satisfy people, because the reason that you go to some community meeting and people are still going to complain, even if the officer that shot him was the same race, is because the police or police incidents are just causes for greater media and political debate, right? Because you guys were invented and you are still there to enforce the law equitably, regardless of the racial or ethnic demographics of the community.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I would say they walk that out really far, where they're like, where they actually start saying that certain, it's mostly like white liberals actually and it's degrading to people of color. They'll be like, well, this law is, enforcing this law, robbery, whatever it is, larceny, is racist, because almost like they can't help themselves. That's kind of the argument where it's like, well, just even forcing this law. Yeah. And it's like, we're so far off reality in the justice scale. It's like, what's the response to that? It's like
yeah. Well, because in that specific case, and they're going to bring up, the phrase that's going to be used almost universally. And I heard this being brought, New York currently has a black former policeman as their mayor. And it was listed in exit polls in the recent election, certainly on a local level, even reliably Democratic voting bases, like most Hispanics and pretty much all blacks in New York, still list crime along with inflation as their major concerns for life, because everyone sort of knows, at least on the ground, that major cities have become much more difficult to live in the past 2.5 years. So even when that's said, okay, even when people kind of know that, what is still said is that if you enforce those laws, you are engaging in, they're going to observe, and then it's going to be implied that it's racist because it involves disparate impact. So if you enforce, kind of your Giuliani broken windows method, you're gonna police the little stuff so that you can police a lot less of the big stuff, right? Which does seem to have worked.
Broken window theory.
Broken window. That if that has disparate racial impact, that is, if your city is 21% black and 42% of your robbery convictions involve black men, then you are doing something obviously wrong. What you can see there is that the major concern, like I said with the LAPD stuff, the major concern then doesn't actually involve crime, justice, or relieving the concerns even of their various non-white voter bases, let alone whether that's fair to anybody else. The major concern is that somehow if you are involving people at a level above their percentage of the population, something is necessarily wrong. Okay. Now this is just never brought up in the case of whites and white collar crime, for example. That's one way you can tell that it's a political tool. It's not a point about justice, but it will be brought up as a point about justice, because the major concern there is never the crime done or the people harmed. It's really just more about using this as a talking point to rally communities and ultimately voter bases and political power in that place, in that city, in that state, in whatever. That's what it's for. There's a sense in which none of this is sincere, and there's a sense in which all of it is in deadly earnest. It isn't earnest about what it is saying. It's earnest about what it means behind what it's saying.
When you hire your local CertaPro painters, you get
the power of doing it right.
Detailed project proposals, excellent customer service, and trusted professionals who get the job done on time and on budget.
The power of experience.
We're kings of the scaffolding and pros with the stucco. We've been there, done that. Get your project started at CertaPro.com and get
the power of pro.
Each CertaPro painter's business is independently owned and operated.
Yeah, it's gross. You just reminded me of when Nancy Pelosi was on Jimmy Kimmel, and like during this pandemic, and people are worried about their jobs and all this stuff, and she's like in her she's one of those politicians pushing the stuff. She's in her kitchen with like dual Sub-Zero refrigerators, the roll-out freezer the size of a coffin. And she's like, what kind of ice cream do I want? There's literally 75 gallons of ice cream. I remember seeing that and going, they're so out of touch. Like she doesn't live in her district. She lives in Washington. You know, it's like,
that's right.
This is out of control.
They're totally out of touch. And I mean, you have, especially in major cities at this point, you're getting a lot of, it's just kind of a weird little thing, but because it's a new thing, it's kind of easy to tell. It's a little easier sometimes when you see the plant when it's small to tell, well, how does it grow to get so big? Is that you have these e-bikes and they can go really fast.
Yeah.
But they're not regulated as traffic like cars, right? So if you're trying to police them in kind of a traffic way, it's a little hard to do. They're running on the sidewalk and they're like injuring people. Okay. But, I was listening to this segment on WNYC, and both the host and his guests are worried that it would be racist if we too stringently made people slow down. Now, this guy could be blowing people over in a neighborhood that is 87% black, but if he is black, then it's still bad to point out that he's doing something wrong. So,
it's crazy.
It is crazy, but it's why, I kind of don't. Police are maybe one of the professions that I envy least, not because you guys are not doing something extremely honorable and necessary, but because in this case you can't win.
Right.
And I don't, in my profession, face nearly, I guess I could get on the news for refusing to do a gay wedding, but the circumstances under which that's going to be a news story, or I'm going to be legally convicted of anything for acting according to my conscience and according to the law, are very, very few. You guys are trying to do something that is extremely necessary, especially in major urban centers, and you kind of can't win, because if you do your job too well, you might be convicted in the media.
Yeah.
And you could be exonerated later, and it just doesn't matter.
I tell you what, Pastor Koontz, that's why these county sheriffs are scooping us all up. They're like, come on out here, boys. We got plenty of room.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a rural area, and the worst thing that I could have done to the policemen in my hometown is tell them something bad that their kid did at school. Right.
Isn't that nice and quaint?
Yeah, and that's wonderful, right? And so I think that, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but my major concern about police going into the future is that the push against the local guys would get renewed in a way that has kind of chilled out. I definitely heard this. The National Democratic Party kind of had this debate. Should we actually say defund the police or not? They had that debate. Moderation has won out for right now. But I'm worried that some of the things that came up in 2020, partly because local sheriffs, even in a California or a Massachusetts or a New York, wouldn't exactly go along with what the governor wanted them to do. And partly also because the local guys, even in large cities, were accused of being racist. I'm worried that local policing is the thing that's under assault. I don't know what you think about that. That's kind of my major concern. Not that you guys are racist, but that you are, and I'm being, tongue in cheek, that you're too responsive to normal people.
Yeah, I can give you firsthand experience. It's a little odd. I see, I am in the country for Massachusetts, Western Mass. But it's still Massachusetts, so it is what it is. And in Western Mass, there's kind of like there's either like you're like a flannel wearing woodsman or you're like a hippie. Like that was traditionally 50 years ago, that would have been accurate. Now it's more like there's super duper liberal cities out here, Northampton, Amherst, which I work very close to. And there is an awful lot there's enough activism signs on lawns where it could hurt your feelings if you were sensitive. Like if you're driving your patrol car,
right?
Nobody likes me out here. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
But what I find is when I interact with these people or when I go to their house for an emergency, it's more like they're in lockstep with what they're seeing on CNN than actually they actually believe. Like none of them didn't really know the tenets of BLM. Like if you used to be able to go on their website and actually see what they stood for, and any average American would be disgusted. It would just like, the destruction of the nuclear family, fathers out of the homes, not the defunding, the abolishment of the police, like all this stuff that's just, communism. And I screenshotted it a long time ago, but I really think, because I've spoken with them, I don't think that's where their head's at, because they'll be like, well, we just thought, wouldn't it be great for you guys to get more help for your complex job? Because you shouldn't be tasked to deal with somebody who's mentally ill and suicidal. You should have a social worker with you, or, where they are critical, they're critical of us, but not their guys, not their local guys. It's kind of like, we're talking about them, not you guys. You guys are, my kid's choking, you come on over and do the Heimlich type of thing. You know what I mean? So a lot of the posturing I see in the political activist lawn game is just posturing. Like it's like they don't deeply believe this stuff.
They don't.
They're just kind of, they're on board with their party.
And you can tell by their actions, right? What they actually believe. I guess what I'm worried about is that their actions will matter less and less the more nationalized our politics become. So, let's independent of any issue that actually matters or is happening in our city, let's elect our first openly lesbian mayor. Let's whatever milestone it is that we're looking for, because it's almost like daily life has turned into posturing, which is why they are decorating their lawns with the signs that they are, even if they don't mean by them what the organization that printed them meant, or they don't mean abolish. They don't even actually mean defund. They mean please add more mental health care, whatever it is that they mean. That their life is kind of a set of posturing, and here we're getting into something that is affecting the police, but it's also affecting everybody else, which is that people are getting very, very, very accustomed to living their life mostly divorced from everyday things and people right around them. And that's not just kind of a like, oh, phones are bad, like, kind of a point. Phones are pretty bad in many ways. But what that means is that people are governing their daily life not by the kind of basic daily life lessons you'd learn from the stuff right in front of you. So anytime you tell your, 12-year-old that they'll understand when they're older, you're appealing to daily life lessons. You're not appealing to like, well, you'll find this on the internet later on.
You'll know when you see the meme, honey.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's not what you're saying. You're appealing to like life happens a certain way. And that's how people come to what we used to call common sense ideas. Like, I don't want my neighborhood to be burned down ritually every presidential election cycle.
Right.
Okay. Like that's bad. Duh. But if people are used to posturing in daily life, whether it's lawn signs or their kid learns something on the internet, so now they have to react the way that they heard from their phone. They're supposed to react when their kid says whatever. That will affect all of us, including the police, because it's almost like we are beginning to govern reality by what we learned in dreamland. And that is something that I certainly see, I don't have police war stories, but from my own profession, wives have learned to hate their husbands for their husbands' political convictions, that their wives basically learned over the course of time on their phones were supposedly evil and destructive, right, that they had no problem with 3 years earlier. And if they hadn't had a phone, they would never have had a problem with. So people will blow up their families over things that they learned in dreamland. And I think that if you extend that, if they're willing to blow up their own families, they're going to go loaded for bear into Thanksgiving dinner, and they're going to, finally destroy grandpa for holding the evil conservative convictions that he has, right? What makes you think they wouldn't be willing to do that to their city?
Right.
So that's kind of what I think could happen. I hope it doesn't. I hope some people come out of dreamland or never went into it, but that is something that I see as a potential future, at least for some places.
Isn't having Christ be the light of your life the best?
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, it completely fixed my worldview, and I can make sense of good and evil, and I know what's true. And thank goodness it happened when it did. I mean, I work with and know so many people, and like you're saying, this little black mirror that we carry around, I've lost, or I don't know if I've lost them or not, but I have had like friends that know me personally, and I promise you my personality hasn't changed, but have disavowed me because a few of them just because I'm Christian, because. Yeah. Whatever it is, your wife's a witch or a Wiccan, and Christianity's evil, man. The whole thing is evil. It's this whole cabal, or just being pro-life. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think like just it used to be like a Coke Pepsi thing, like Democrat Republican. You know what I mean? Like, right, you do your thing, but you can't. Like you were saying, you can't come to that understanding where you're looking the person face to face. You're really reading them. You're understanding. Maybe they've had something real hard in their life. They have really, really hard time dealing with that decision, or they don't like your stance on it. It's hard to know how to love somebody when they're through here. Yeah. And it's really easy to hate somebody through there, because you don't have the inflection of their voice. You don't have their face. You can't see if they're nervous. Like, it's just easy. Because I've been written off, and I haven't even been given a chance. Yeah, and I'm. It's almost like I'm begging. I'm like, God, I'm not like a different person, but I do have I have moral views. Like, I don't. We don't need to torch our friendship. You know what I mean? But just me having those views is annoying enough that they can't do it.
They can't handle it anymore. And I think that, I mean, you guys know this from your profession, is that darkness is much easier than light. Evil comes, destruction comes, complete and utter burning everything down comes much more easily to human beings than light and reconciliation and understanding and wisdom come. It's why wisdom is hard to acquire in our lives, and foolishness is easy to do. So I think that, when you're thinking about the light of Christ, it's something that some people would say, well, there's less of it than there used to be in our cities, in our families. That's true. I think, however, that it is shining all the more brightly precisely because of how much darkness there is, even in the average home. Often through that little screen, the darkness is coming in. I think the light is shining all the more brightly in that time, the more sadness and darkness there is around it.
Yeah, the contrast should be true. I hope that's true. Pastor Koontz, we're almost on an hour here. I don't want to keep you too long, but can we approach briefly the claim of the Southern slave police? I mean, I want to know, is that, I mean, it sounds to me, it sounds like okay, so, but in my mind, where I'm not like being emotional about it, I think, okay, well, that was the law of the land, so they made a police force to enforce their law. That doesn't make, like, the logic doesn't follow to that makes police racist. That just means they lived in a culture that accepted that racism, and they had people to carry it out. So, I mean, they all collectively agreed on it. So but the cops are the ones that are, it's like, how do they form?
So that's a confusion between that. It's very common that people make between something that is in one given time and place legally right with what is in every time and place morally right. And a lot of people can't ever tell the difference. So if something is not against the law, they generally think it's fine. Most people are wired that way. They're wired that way. You mentioned pro-lifer. They're wired that way with abortion. If it's legal, they think it's fine.
Right.
And if it's against the law, they think that's right.
We just have like no grace for these people, right? We're like, damn them all.
Yeah, right. So I think with the idea of people enforcing slave codes or what was usually actually privatized in the South, which was recovering escaped slaves, which wasn't often enforced in the North. Some jurisdictions in the North enforced the fugitive slave law and some did not. So the idea that somehow that's attached to policing as a social function of the justice system is silly, because it was disputed even at the time between different jurisdictions whether it was going to be enforced. But I think the more basic confusion is the way that people get confused between, well, this was legally accepted, so therefore it's morally okay, or people thought it was morally okay. And that's just a common confusion people have, I think, even down to today.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And slavery is ugly, especially it's wrong. Racial slavery especially is nasty. And I'm not saying it didn't have ripples through their community. It clearly has. But it's interesting I've heard the argument for people against the Bible, against the word, for the Bible basically it condones slavery, which it does not. It talks about slavery because it's a reality of humankind. That's what we're capable of. And I think a lot of the slavery, and you could obviously school me on this, but I think what I heard was a lot of the slavery in like the Old Testament was like debt slavery. It was like you couldn't pay your debt, so now you're a slave. Then of course there's the slaves. Obviously the Jewish people were slaves to Pharaoh. But then it's like, it's not that that racial based slavery that the U.S. had, but it goes, so the whole spectrum of it is very deep, going back to like the Africans, kings collecting these people and selling their own people to, none of it's right, but it's like, aren't people at all interested in like how the deeper versions of everything? Isn't the world interesting and evil and terrible? I mean, look at, like, they say, like, St. Paul said, like, to slaves, obey your masters. Well, that's only because he knows the reality of slavery, because he knows the evilness in man's heart, because he knows we can't escape evil like that. But if the slave has Christ and obeys his master, he can be at peace. And really, what is this life compared to eternal life? That's to me, that's the whole picture.
Yeah. So, in the Bible, slavery is almost always debt slavery. Sometimes it's ethnic. There are ethnic groups like the Jews in Egypt at one point who are enslaved to another ethnicity, race being kind of a higher level concept, but related to the idea of ethnicity. The Bible accepts that slavery exists in the same way that it accepts that a lot of things exist, and advises people to work within those structures at times. But it's just a historical fact that the vast majority of slaves also in the world today were not enslaved by anyone in the United States, but rather largely in Africa and especially in the Middle East. The Arab slave trade was always larger than the slave trade to the New World. And the only countries that ever actively began to abolish slavery were white Christian countries, motivated by the Bible. Look up William Wilberforce if you want an example of this. So activity against slavery proceeded out of the very people who are now generally assumed to be the worst culprits, I suppose, of slavery ever, when in fact the opposite was the case. That's also a different question from whether, if I suffered injustice in the past in any way, class-based, race-based, whatever, that excuses the fact that I'm stealing something today or shooting someone tomorrow. And the answer, both on the basis of natural law that anybody could figure out as well as the Bible, is that no, I am morally responsible for myself, whatever it is that has happened to me or been done to me or to my ancestors. Because generally, and this is certainly witnessed in the Bible, if you look at anybody's ancestors, there is some mix of horror done to them and horror done by them.
Right.
And because that's true for humanity, because we're all kind of horrible, it's not an excuse for anyone to steal today or to kill tomorrow.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I see it all the time with people, with friends that don't have Christ, don't have faith, and they're, like, as they say, you come to the end of yourself. They're just, I'm 43 now. It's not the party's over, and thankfully, I'm blessed to have, I got 3 kids, a beautiful wife. I was called to God by the word. I couldn't ask for anything more, but, if I had kept going how I was going, I mean, how much you can make enough money to drink as much as you want, or you can make enough money to do as many drugs as you want, or eat as much as you want, or see all the movies and travel all you want. It's still so unfulfilling.
It's empty. Yeah,
it's empty. And I'm seeing that now. And I kind of wonder, and this is way off subject, but I kind of wonder, with the apparent obsession with like pedophilia in like, not just our society now, but just in the upper echelons of all culture, when you reach that boy touching, level in these ancient places where it's like they have vomitoriums, like they have everything. Yeah. And then it's like this, it's almost like in a sick way, like this pedophilia type thing is like the last thing. It's like the last thing to their weird carnal, unchecked desires, like is there that are controlling them?
And when you are in the darkness long enough, your eyes get accustomed, but then I think they seek out more darkness. Okay, they're pushed into greater darkness. So my eyes are accustomed to that level of darkness. Now I want something darker, and it's very similar in the darkness as it is in the light, that we are really not in control of ourselves the way we think. And in the darkness, that's horrible. And in the light, that's wonderful, but it's just generally true. Human beings are not as in control of their lives as they often imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine without a guiding light, because at the end of every single day, when I say my prayers, I'm like, man, I'm still astounded how badly I screw up. You know what I mean? It's like, wow.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You're not good.
Exactly.
So, but I'm trying. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
So when you're not trying. Exactly. Pastor Koontz, before we go, I know from listening to you speak and listening to your podcast, Brief History of Power, you were a little bit later coming to Christ. How old were you, and how did that happen?
So I was 18, and I was attending a college outside Philadelphia, Swarthmore College, and I had not been raised in church. And I was reading things by people who had become Christians. The big guys for me were T.S. Eliot, who's a writer, and then C.S. Lewis, that some people might have heard of. Yeah, who's a really great writer, explains things in a really helpful, lively way. And I was looking around. So this is pre-smartphone. That's how old I am. This is pre-smartphone. So I'm looking around and I'm seeing the lives of the people that I'm with, and they seem hollow. And I feel hollow. And I think some of that was God putting me in a place where I was kind of the only lost person from Appalachia in my college, and that loneliness was kind of productive in my soul.
Appalachia or whatever.
Yes.
Holy cow.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, so people around me are like, oh, do you, are your parents first cousins and blah, blah, blah. And so you're
nice, so welcoming.
Yeah. Nice people. That loneliness was kind of productive because it makes you think about things a little deeper than if you're totally comfortable. But also I was thinking, maybe there's something more to life than finishing college and getting a good job, which we're all kind of set up for by virtue of having gotten into this school. So, right. Because if you have things kind of together in a certain way in life, you begin to wonder, not that I came to the end of myself in a desperate way, like you were talking about earlier, but I came to the end of myself in the sense of like, is this all that life is about? It's like, you got a good job. And if that's not true, then maybe there's something more to life, and maybe some of the things that I was raised to believe would make more sense if I had the light of Christ in my life. So that's what I began to seek out. So I started going to church, and I was wearing a suit like a weirdo because I thought that's what everybody wore to church.
I love it. That's so great.
And I, reading the Bible like a nut because I thought that's just what you do.
I love you have the heart of like a man from the 40s. It's great.
Yeah, I know. No, I think I was definitely born at the wrong time in many ways. But yeah, I mean, it takes a mysterious course because that's the way it is. So in the same way that darkness was controlling me in a way I didn't understand, the light kind of took me into itself and guided me. Christ guided me and guides me in a way that I still don't understand.
It's beautiful. I love it. Why Lutheran?
Lutheran because eventually, so I started going to what's called an Episcopal church, which is a little bit, is ultimately a lot different than a Lutheran church. But
it used to be good a long time ago.
It used to be pretty good, yeah. But I was reading the Bible and just noticing conflicts between what the priests were saying up front and what the Bible said. And I was like, look, if I'm going to do this Christianity thing, I'm going to do it 150%. So right. I need somewhere where there's a matchup between what's going on up front and what the Bible says, what God says. And so that's how I found the Lutheran Church.
Awesome. I love it. Pastor Dr. Koontz, thank you so much for coming on, brother. I really appreciate it.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
I'm going to do the outro. Will you hang in the green room for a second?
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. Hey, guys, that was Pastor Koontz on the history of policing and racism and all that good stuff. Such a fun interview. Thank you to him for coming on. Guys, thank you for the repeated 5-star reviews, as I said before. And now it's the time of the show where we got to thank the sponsors, the sergeants, the Patreon sergeants. Who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Scott Young, Wayne Miller, Nick Noose, the great Tom Connell, Dennis, because he only put his first name, Andrew Proctor, George Tessier, Motor Cop Chronicles, Ilian Rogers, Greg Gadboy, Ben Peters, the great Scott Minkler, Parker Brower, Tammy Wall, Sean Clifford, Braden Walker, Sasha McNabb, Corey Payne, Mike Wynn, Nathan Gowan, Jason Lau, Dylan Pyrozik, the great Sarah Pomeroy from Down Under, Lauren Stimson, Alec Wazik, Brandon Hooker, Jake Pinito, John Shoemaker, James Rose, Seth Wright, Tony Fahey, William James Long, that's Deputy William James Long to you, Andy Biggs, Chris June, Adam Mihal, the great Gary Steiner, and the handsome Lane Campbell. Guys, thank you. That's a mouthful, but I love you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being sponsors of the show. Gotta warn you, probably gonna have to break that list up as it grows, but I'm really appreciative for it. You guys really keep the lights on, keep the boat afloat over here. So thank you muchly. Thank you for tuning in this week. And yeah, we'll catch you next week. I'm gonna leave you guys with a little bit of Lutheran culture. Enjoy.